Welcome and thank you for joining us. The name of this program is Straight Talk, a public affairs conversation sponsored by the Midland Cultural Centre here in North Simcoe. My name is Doug Mond and I'm the moderator of Straight Talk. I wish to acknowledge and thank our season sponsor, Brampton Brick, for their generous support for this program and MCC community programming. Everywhere you go these days, you hear Canadians talking about the same thing. And no, it's not the pandemic, and it's not even hockey. Everyone's talking about the high cost of real estate and the market frenzy, which a recent editorial in the Globe and Mail referred to as mania. Many Canadians are worried about the cost of even the most basic housing and how it's getting out of reach for many people. So our topic today joins that ongoing debate. It's a question urgently looking for solutions across Ontario and frankly across the entire country. So tonight we're asking the rhetorical question, are we pricing ourselves out of house and home? Last week, the Ontario Affordability Task Force submitted comprehensive recommendations to the Government of Ontario. The report calls for immediate action to solve what they describe as a housing crisis in Ontario. And the task force framed the problem this way, and I'm quoting them. House prices have almost tripled in the past 10 years, growing much faster than incomes. This has put home ownership beyond the reach of first-time buyers across the province, even those with well-paying jobs. Housing has become too expensive for rental units, and it's become too expensive in rural communities and small towns. The system is not working as it should. And that's the end of the quote, but I believe that puts the problem we're facing mildly. So how do we get to this place? And more importantly, what can government and industry do about it? Can the market just sort it out? If not, what can governments do working with builders to solve the problem? So we've assembled a panel of experts with a wealth of experience in housing and housing issues to ask them these questions today. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guests and also thank them very sincerely for being here with us. I'd like to start with Steve Marshall. Steve, if you could just say hello, please.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me, and thanks for thinking my opinion might mean something.
Well, it does, and we're so glad you're here, Steve. Steve, by way of introduction, is the founder of Northern Shield Development Corporation and has years of success in developing and building affordable and safe housing in First Nations and remote communities. He's a pioneer in the field of contained modular construction and has completed over $75 million worth of modular construction projects in 12 countries. Steve is known to be a passionate advocate of solution-focused housing development. Good to see you, Steve.
Thanks for having me again.
I next would like to introduce Grace Kidd. Hello, Grace, or hola. Grace is joining us tonight from Spain, where it's 1:30 a.m. So I so appreciate you joining us, Grace, and I hope there's strong coffee on to get you through the next hour.
My pleasure.
Now, Grace has been a successful real estate agent and mortgage broker in North Simcoe for 3 decades. And she has extensive experience in commercial and multi-unit real estate, including involvement in local nonprofit projects in her community. She's a very passionate volunteer in this North Simcoe community. And Grace has also been the past president of the Southern Georgian Bay Real Estate Board, and in 2010 was nominated for Businesswoman of the Year. So thank you so much, Grace. And we will do this in English. We won't switch to Spanish unless the spirit moves us tonight.
Okay, gracias.
And our third panelist is Scott Leon. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Scott is a researcher with the Wellesley Institute in Toronto, and he's conducted extensive research and analysis into housing affordability, evictions, economic inequality, and income security policies. Scott has years of engagement on the ground with the most seriously affected members of our community who bear the impact of this housing crisis. He's currently partnering in a 5-year study into supporting transitions from youth homelessness with CAMH, Covenant House, and other Toronto institutions that you would know. So glad you could join us, Scott, and thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
So I've asked our panel members just at the get-go if they could briefly give us their own personal experience as to what's contributed to this housing crisis. If this problem has been 30 years in the making, as some say it is, how did we get to this place here in 2022? And what do you think, from your perspective, are the best solutions to housing affordability? I'm going to start in the order of their introductions. So Steve, if you could lead off our discussion tonight, I would appreciate it.
Again, my pleasure. And so, I mean, as you pointed out, over the years, we've done, as a business, all kinds of different developments and different types of housing and all different types of community, ranging from as far north and as remote as you think you can get, right through to, what we sort of deem as our southern marketplace, ironically, which is sort of the Simcoe County region. And from an affordability standpoint, the reality of the situation is it's quite honestly an hourly conversation within our business. And so the breadth of our business stems from, everything from workforce housing, where we've been up in the Alberta oil patch when Fort McMurray went nuts in housing, and everything across Northern Ontario for mining and all these different types of resource projects, into affordable housing, where for years our largest customers were different divisions of the government, building different types of affordability for different marketplaces and in communities that were on and off reserve as far as our Aboriginal and Indigenous experience goes, but into places like Barrie and Orillia and communities like that, and then stemming right through to individuals that are looking to us for some form of housing, whether that's some kind of crazy high-end, container style housing. But quite honestly, the majority of the residential conversations and inquiries we get are people trying to find different solutions to be able to build a home that's still attractive and it's affordable. And so we see the marketplace from all different segments for years, really, for the better part of, for more than a decade. And so we've certainly seen the rise in costs. We've seen the issues that are being created, and and part of the the conversation package that we had before, just about whether this is endemic. We're in a spot here that's very, very difficult to overcome, and you look at trying to pinpoint one specific thing, and the truth of the matter is it's a gigantic plate of spaghetti where one thing touches the next, touches to the next, and it's a complicated and convoluted style of issue that we have to sort of figure out a way to overcome. And there's ways to do it, but it's not without challenges.
Steve, I don't want to focus too much on this. We want to get into the discussion, but some people think that there's such interest in this now from all levels of government, from industry, that there might be a consensus that now's the time to drill down on some solutions. Are you an optimist about that?
I'm an optimist for sure. And I think there are solutions out there. I think there's markets that, are further ahead of us, certainly here provincially or, from a country standpoint that's dealt with affordability. And I think there's different things that we can look to and different experiences that we can draw from in other countries and other markets. But I'm an optimist for sure. But there's a caveat to that, or I guess an asterisk, that I would put beside that. And the reality is my optimism really comes by way of, some of the government interaction that has to occur, and my own personal opinion when it comes to affordability. And so depending on who we have in power and what the motives are for affordability, which they're all going to have to face that come through the next election, whether that be provincially or federally. But I think it has to be addressed, and I think there's a culmination of things that have to happen between the public and the private sector for us to be able to strive forward. And I think the pressure, just like anything else, when it becomes political, there has to be some form of release valve, and I'm optimistic that will spill into some form of affordability.
Okay, thanks, Steve, very much. We'll get back to you on that point. Grace, you've obviously been following the market very closely for many years. You've seen what the Globe and Mail calls a frenzied market, mania. What's your sense of this situation, Grace?
Well, in our particular area, North Simcoe, I think that for years we've been seeing the push north, I'll call it. So where the leading edge of the baby boomers started a few years ago, or more than a few years ago, but probably more than a decade ago, coming north, buying secondary properties with the idea that they were going to retire up here. So it started then, but that has increased to a tidal wave. It's a tsunami of people moving from the GTA to the northern communities. And certainly it has created, the bidding wars started in Toronto and they moved north as well. So that's part of the issue as far as I'm concerned, because 5 years ago, a couple who were earning, I would say the average wage in our community, if you're not a professional, a schooled professional, is probably $20 an hour. So two people in our community earning $20 an hour, maybe somebody working in a retail outlet and somebody else working in a factory, could afford to buy a home. Because you could buy a home in Midland, for instance. There were still homes that you could buy 5 years ago for $200,000. Today, there is no home in Midland that you can buy for under $400,000. So, and I've seen that in other ways every day. And so there's the ripple effect. It's like the pebble has been dropped in the water, and the ripple effect from that is that people who own rental properties, I have a case of that in my office. One of my employees has lived in the same home for many, many years now. In fact, I would guess she has paid off the owner's mortgage in full with her rent. And the market is so good, and they've reached an age, they're in their 70s, and they've just said, we want to be, we want to cash in. So they bought that property for under $100,000, and it's worth almost $500,000 now. And so now we have somebody who, a single mom, who was paying $800 a month for a house, and she was paying all the utilities, doing all the upkeep herself. And she's now an empty nester, and she's been offered a 1-bedroom apartment in a basement for $1,440 plus utilities, and to share the shoveling and grass and everything with the people who are living upstairs in the 3-bedroom main floor unit. So that's what I see every day. I have people calling me with exactly that same issue every day. And one other sort of thing that I would like to add to that is I'm on the board of directors for the Guest House in Midland, which is a homeless shelter. And I started there 5 years ago as a volunteer cook. And I cook every year at Christmas along with other days. But the first year that I cooked at Christmas, there was 20 people. And the year before the pandemic began, there were 30 people. And last year there were 40 people. And this year I cooked for 60 people, including 8 children. So there are many, many people in our communities that are just a paycheck or two away from being homeless, or a landlord who wants to sell away from being homeless. And there's not a lot of creation of new residential dwellings. There was in Midland, the town of Midland created a bylaw to allow people to put basement apartments in their single family residence. Yeah. And that was about 5 or 6 years ago. And when that happened, there was a group of investors that came in from over Collingwood Way, and they bought up just about every single family home in Midland as they came on the market. They bought up all the apartments, and they control the rent in our area, that group of investors. And those are the kinds of things that have happened to, really sort of tighten that noose. it's a many-factored thing. And also, I have to say, the stress test, the three stressed tests that have been initiated by the federal government in the last 4 years have strangled, have done exactly the opposite of what they were supposed to do. Because people who bought a home 5 years ago for $200,000 that were first-time home buyers that still now have a $190,000 mortgage can't put their house on the market, even if they want to move up to the next level, because they can't pass the stress test to get a new mortgage.
All right. Well, I'm sure we're going to hear about that. You're not a big fan of that little mechanism to cool the market, then, right?
It has not cooled the market. It has heated the market up to the boiling point.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to talk some more about that, Grace. Okay. Thank you so much. There's lots to bear down on. Can I go to you now, Scott, if I may? You heard some things that I think resonate with the work you've been doing, and you're looking at macro policy. What do you think is driving this market, and what solutions are you attracted to?
Yeah, for sure. I think Steve and Grace had hit on a lot of really good points there. And I think we've really seen, you talked about how this has been emerging over the past 30 years. And we've really seen throughout this time, housing stress, in particular for low and moderate income households across Ontario, but that this is widening for even middle class households, middle income households now that are becoming housing stressed. And we're really seeing, I think, what Grace was saying really spoke to this, a system that is creating large winners and losers, and that this gulf between people that are seeing quite large capital gains on home ownership and then renters who haven't seen these gains and are paying higher rents and increasingly stressed. I think we're seeing this gulf really widen. I've been working with youth in Toronto, trying to support their transitions out of homelessness. And we're really seeing so few places for youth to transition to. We've seen a number of providers producing really great supportive and transitional housing in Toronto. But after a year or two in this transitional housing, finding an apartment on disability benefits or on $15 or $20 an hour wages is nigh impossible. It's something that it almost goes without saying that housing is a necessity for a healthy life. Having stable, affordable housing that doesn't harm your health is required for everyone to live and thrive. And we're seeing so many people in our society that can't access housing that supports their health. So I think there's a lot of things that we can move forward with. I was happy to see some of the recommendations out of the Ontario Task Force report around increasing market supply of housing. Though I was a little bit disheartened with the lack or the absence really of talking about affordable rental housing, supportive housing, which was really just kind of tagged onto that report as an appendix. And, you asked if the housing market can correct for this. I don't see any way that a private rental market is going to produce housing that meets the needs of everyone in our society.
They won't. Just by the nature of private housing, and when you look at all the different issues that come into housing, cost of land, and as a for-profit, private business, the highest and best use of a dollar is an affordable housing. And then you go back through, for individuals like us, right? We tried to build on our own. We did our own homegrown experiment in Aurelia, building 27 apartment units, and we had literally zero help from anybody trying to do that. And that exercise was extremely revealing. And from a banking standpoint, in the private markets, affordability is so by the terminology, right? Whether you call it affordable or attainable, and whether that's by a CMHC standard of 80% of market rents and all this other stuff. At the end of the day, when I'm using the term affordability, for context, is I'm just trying to talk about building stuff that people can afford, like the everyday person. So, Grace, you had pointed out, two working individuals, right, working full time, or I'm guessing more than 40 hours a week, breaking their backs, and they can't even find a place to to rent. And, Scott, to your point, right, mental health and housing. I mean, I'm certainly not a psychologist or trained in that regard, but I'm also not an idiot. And people need stability in order to have any sort of, mental peace and mental wherewithal. And if the stress of not having a home, or the stress of not being able to afford a home, or the stress of not being able to rent is a major stress. And so, like I can tell you, in our workforce, we deal with that. There's individuals that work for my company that we've hired that are homeless. And we see that firsthand, like real time, every single day. And some of the social economic things that come along with homelessness, and some of the challenges that are presented there. And housing, I mean, in a country like Canada, it's always difficult when people say rights, right? People dig their heels in on what's a right and what's not a right, and what are we right to do, particularly now, ironically, in the context of what's happening in Ottawa. But at the same time, when it boils down to housing, we need to be able to find housing for people that, especially employed people and people that are working. And there's tiers in housing, right? And the hardest to house are always going to be the hardest to house. And so the private sector, marketplace and individuals like myself, and we're peanuts compared to, to some of the big companies that are out there, even the mid-sized companies that are out there. But at the same time, there's no money in affordable housing. And so even when we try as a developer, when we try and build something as, cost effectively as we possibly can, when we go into one, it was damn near impossible for us to get construction financing in the first place, because we're modular. And so there's some other problems with housing in Canada and in Ontario when it comes to what we deem a house or what a house should be built of, because we still deal with a government, in my experience, that, still thinks you can build something for $150 a square foot, out of 2x4s and all the other things that are out there, where you have building code that's, that's telling us that we need to have walls that are 4 feet thick to get, to certain R values. And so everything is moving against affordability, right? Everybody that's in the construction marketplace, whether you're, a landowner, you're selling land, everybody wants a premium for their service. Everybody wants a premium for the material. Everybody that's involved wants a premium for everything. And, when you tie that all together and say, when I pour that out and I put it all in the blender and dump that out into what I'm going to charge these renters, those costs are expensive. And we had a real-time situation in Orillia where we, as the owners, as private owners, we're comfortable at, setting the market rent at a certain rate. And we said, okay, let's try and set it here. Like this, comparatively to the rest of Orillia, was affordable. It was the lowest rent that was available in Orillia. And when we went and tried to get takeout financing, the banks wouldn't provide us with takeout financing because they didn't like our debt service ratios. And so, and that stems right back to CMHC, right? And having something CMHC insured so that we could try and get the interest rates low enough to be able to make sure we could carry our costs. And ironically, it was the banks that forced the rents up in order just to be able to get to take out financing. And so the private marketplace, Scott, to your point, on its own, there's no solution in that, in that space, right? Unless somebody's doing purely for, altruism, or somebody's willing to donate their land and their time and put, subsidies or grants that are in place on their own to be able to carry the cost of housing. The private sector, there's no motivation. Truth be told, and nobody likes to talk about the truth behind affordable housing, but truth be told is there's no motive for the private sector to create affordable housing. There's no money in it.
It occurs to me that some of our older viewers will remember a time in the 50s and 60s when the problem wasn't obvious. People could do rental accommodation. It paid the person that built rental accommodation, commercial accommodation like that. And it seems to me that the stories that I read about this come from two perspectives. One article was saying that it's more of an income problem than a housing affordability problem. And I was interested in the fact that while the values of real estate, ownership real estate, would have tripled in 10 years, during that time, incomes went up 38%. So there's nowhere near they're keeping pace with these increases. I guess I'm trying to help our viewers get their heads around what are the main factors. Is it supply scarcity means price increases for all kinds of reasons that you've already commented on, Steve? The mortgage rates, household incomes. What do you think the real culprits are in getting to this point where people aren't being able to afford the most basic accommodation.
Well, it's not the mortgage rates.
No?
It's not the mortgage rates for sure, because they've been at an all-time low for an all-time long time. So that's not the issue. The issue is that everything to provide housing has gone up exponentially more than what salaries have gone up.
You're talking about building costs, Grace? You're talking about building costs?
Building costs have gone up. I mean, you look at the price of a lot. 5 years ago, you could buy a lot in Tiny Township for under $40,000. Now you can't buy a lot in Tiny Township for less than $200,000. You know, the cost to put services in, the cost of building. I would like to suggest that, and this is not a solution that comes from the general public, but I would like to suggest that municipalities have a responsibility, for instance, to infill some of the property that's in the middle of places. And one of the things that I see is that people who live in municipalities, first of all, have the not in my backyard way of thinking. So, and I think that people do things to get reelected rather than fulfill. Every community in the area that I work, part of their mandate as a municipal government is to deal with homelessness, every one of them. So what can they do? Because I don't see any of them doing anything on their own. I think part of the problem is that it takes forever to get anything done. However, if you get individuals to try and do things like eat that elephant one bite at a time. So I'm working with a not-for-profit, and we approached the Penetanguishene, and we managed to get 2 lots from them at bottom price. The municipality held financing on those 2 lots for them to be built out and allowed us to put basement apartments in. So we created 4 units for lower income people.
Okay.
So I do believe, and this was excess land that Penetang had. They had lots of excess land. We were only approved for 2. So, you know, the people that I was working with. But now, through that experience, that same group has now bought 5 lots. Not in Penetang, but in the general North Simcoe area, and we'll be building 5 more homes with basement apartments. So that will mean that in less than 2 years, we have created 14 homes for lower income families. I believe that the way to do this is not to build monster structures, but to go about it that way. In every town, there is property that the municipality has taken back for taxes or has been given to them as part of a subdivision build that they're just not using. They don't have the money to put more parks in and that sort of thing. Or they should be selling it for taxes anyway. I think that there's an opportunity there. When you don't have to pay 200 grand or 300 grand or 500 grand for a lot, you can then afford to build more housing that people who are on the lower income scale can afford to be in. So, you know, I do believe that that's part of, for me, I'm always solution driven. And I think that that's a solution that we can work towards in every municipality. And we used a local builder. And I think that there's lots of local builders who will sharpen their pencil if everybody cooperates. in the grander scheme of things.
Okay. Well, it looks like Scott is preparing to say hallelujah to some of that. Scott, am I reading you correctly?
Yeah, and I can really relate with some of my own experiences as well. Doug, I think you spoke about a couple of factors there that I think are contributing to higher housing prices. One that I'd really like to talk about is the stagnation of social and non-market housing in Canada, really since the 90s. We have seen a re-engagement on housing issues, and I think this is really driven by people caring about it, and the political impetus put pressure on politicians to start moving back into providing housing that people below median income can actually afford. Though I think we have been seeing problems with the new affordable housing programs that have been developed through the National Housing Strategy. Well, it's a welcome addition. There is definitely more that can be done. One of the main issues is a lot of those programs really are loans, like low-cost loans, which is great. We need to have more financing, but loans will only get us so much affordability. We need grants and we need operating subsidies to be able to get rents that are in the range of somebody living on ODSP, on disability payments, or somebody that's making $15 an hour with an hourly wage. So we've seen some successful programs, like I think the Rapid Housing Initiative, producing modular housing for people transitioning out of homelessness with quite low rents. Though the other programs I think really do require some tweaks. The other thing is the definitions of affordability on these programs. Sometimes are kind of tricky to believe. One program, the rental construction finance,
I would say ridiculous.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to interrupt. You were being very political. I was not. But
gentlemen, explain that to the uninitiated, because you're in agreement, but we're not really sure what you're agreeing on.
Some of these affordable apartments through the Rental Construction Finance Initiative are $2,000 a month. So they're way out of the price range of anybody in poverty. They're actually higher than median renter incomes across Canada, or even in the region of the areas that these are built.
What income would you need to meet that particular level of housing cost?
Yeah, what's my basic arithmetic here? It'd be 70,000 plus, more than that.
Oh yeah, more than that. Yeah.
Okay.
If you go by sort of banking standards, they say that you should spend no more than a third of your income on housing. So multiply by 3. So you have to be earning at least $6,000 a month. That's $72,000 a year to afford to pay $2,000 a month in housing.
But that's after tax dollars, right? Like when you do the math, Grace, I agree with you. But 72 grand at whatever the tax bracket is for $72,000. Like, for argument's sake, call it 20% just for the sake of a conversation. Like 72 grand when you knock $14,000 or $15,000 off that, when you're talking about your take home, a third of your income, because that number gets thrown around and used all the time. And that's kind of what I would put in the same pot as my comment was to Scott, is being ridiculous, because that's not factual. Like your net income is what you actually receive, right? And so, right now we're in a place where, every time we spend $1, the dollar that we paid, or received after taxes, after the government's taken their taxes, we got to throw 13% on everything that we buy. And so your dollar goes hardly anywhere now. Like people making six figures. I remember a kid, being a kid thinking, a 6-figure income, $1 million home. Like I drive by $1 million homes, every day, where I live in Innisfil and Barrie. And I look at those, and my memory of $1 million home doesn't look like, a subdivision home. And so when I say ridiculous, and Scott, like the programs, right? The Rapid Housing Initiative, or, the National Housing Strategy, like, really what those things boil down to are political recommendations and statements. There's no plan behind those. And so I can tell you from, again, only speaking from personal experiences, we were part of 12 submissions for the Rapid Housing Initiative. And so, and we met all the criteria, being shovel ready, being modular, being something that can be built in a year, and so on and so forth, and all the regulations that the government set out. We went 0 for 12. And I don't know of another housing provider from Victoria to Newfoundland that received the other $500 million when it came to the market stream, right? Because the rapid housing initiative, for the audience that may not be familiar with it, is the government, said they're throwing out $1 billion for affordable housing, and $500 million went to what they call the city stream. So the city of Toronto and, the Kitcheners, the Waterloos, the Londons, the Vancouvers, the Edmontons, they were all announced what their chunks were, right? They're millions of dollars that they gave to the cities to build affordable housing. The other $500 million was sort of an open market tender with very specified requirements on what you would have to do to be able to meet those requirements. And when you peel back the layers of housing across Canada, there were really only a handful of people that could have met those requirements when it came to the modular side and some of the stipulations that were required by the government. And to this day, I Google it quite often, because we just went through the second round of rapid housing initiatives, and I don't see anywhere where the government's announced anywhere where they've given that $500 million to anyone. So the numbers sound fantastic, but the actuality of it, and Doug, even the report, that just came out with the recommendations on housing, right? Well, here's what we think we should do, but the should and the actual are the real divide, and what's causing the problem here. And there's not enough context around, actioning the things that really do need to happen. It's great to say, we need 1.5 million, homes over, a 10-year plan. That's fantastic. We certainly do need more housing stock, but the controls behind that, and Grace pointed out something, earlier on, where, if there's a good deal, the investors find the good deals first. And so if there's not regulations and stipulations on who can buy what, it's the same thing, with phase one housing and subdivisions, right? That's mostly bought up by people with money. They buy phase one because they know phase two. They're buying equity immediately.
From a developer's point of view, is there some stuff in that affordability task force that might grease the wheels a little bit in terms of gentle density and certain things as of right, and the planning and zoning process being changed to get to perhaps minimize red tape and delay and things of that nature?
Yeah.
I'm going to ask all the panelists, would you see any good in it, Steve?
Yeah, and I'll try and be super short, because I could spend the hour talking myself. And so yes, Grace, you pointed it out. In order to receive a building permit just about anywhere is insane. The time period, the requirements, the stipulations, the nonsense, the bureaucracy, it takes forever to get a building permit in most communities. Simcoe County, there's some, I won't name names right now out of the sake of being politically correct, that are so far out of control, it's not even funny, to the place where people are just walking away saying, we're not going to build here anymore. It's ridiculous. So yeah, that has to change. The red tape around housing has to be changed. And ironically, I'll make a simple point, is that the regulations now and what it takes to build a home with building code, and the building code is always additive. We never remove anything from building code. We just add to it, and then we try and modify to it. And we have these crazy building codes that have these crazy requirements. And every time somebody adds to the building code, the cost goes up, and 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 the complexity goes up. And so we still have wartime homes in our area, like Simcoe County, Midland, Penetang, and Scott, I'm not quite sure where you live, but I mean, Toronto, pick a place. There's homes that were built 100 years ago that are still standing. And so I question some of the things that happen in building code as to, what we need to provide for housing, particularly as it relates to cost. So that has to change. The other thing, that's inside of those reports that, that I do think make, a lot of sense, really boil back to the same facts. Like, this is a little bit mathematical, with a dash of political will. So you buy land at X, your build costs are X, your soft costs, which are also out of control. By the time you get a building permit in a lot of these communities, they tag you through the teeth, again, pointing out to Grace's analogy of Tiny. Like, I just built a home in Tiny. We're building 4 more homes in Tiny. I'm trying to buy property in Tiny. And Grace, I'm pointing out you were incorrect. There was one lot for $199,900. So there is something under $200,000. So, but that being said, by the time you pay through all the different things that you have to get to, like, you're on your way to $250,000, before you throw anything related to your actual house on top of that property.
Well, before we end this discussion, Steve, I'd like you to tell me, because I'm going to give you godlike power to be the Minister of Housing, but not even constrained by cabinet or the Premier, for what, from a development point of view, a couple of things that would really help steam over these frustrations. But if you just give me a second, I want to ask the other members of the panel what they think of this affordability task force. I know I'll start with you, Scott, because you already expressed your disappointment about what wasn't in it, wasn't in the mandate for them. But I take your point. But is there anything in there that would help municipalities sort of infill or at least deal with, some density as a solution approaches?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's really what the report focused on, was reducing barriers to construction. And I think there's a lot to be done there. Even barriers to affordable and non-market housing. Was working with a nonprofit developer in the east end of Toronto. I live in Toronto in Parkdale, where all the houses, even the tiny row houses, are well over $1 million now. But I was working with a developer, nonprofit developer in the east end, trying to get a building built. And the years of delay, the capped density, the construction costs increasing as we waited. This ended up being a development that we had to walk away from. There's so many different ways that the barriers can be addressed. For private market developments, removing what they've been calling exclusionary zoning, so allowing more, small, middle, medium, and even large scale private developments to help boost supply is a long run solution. And just to kind of shoehorn in one other thing that's not in your question, Grace, you were talking about how, there's this standard affordability metric of 30% of your income on rent. So that the bottom quintile, so that the poorest 20% of households in Ontario, only 1 in 4 meet that threshold. So 75% of them are actually paying more than this. Half of them are paying over 50% of their incomes on rent. And this is a demographic that was totally left out of the affordability task force. So, it's great to see a kind of supply side, market-oriented plan to produce more housing and address affordability, but ignoring the populations with the greatest need, it's hard to get me behind it 100%, right?
Okay. Grace, I don't know whether you had a chance over there to get into the affordability recommendations, whether if you had any opinion about that.
Well, I think that we need to be able to, some communities are using tiny homes, and it's worked very well for single people. I think that many municipalities still have something on the books that says you have to build 720 square feet or 820 square feet or 850 or whatever it is. And I think that realistically, people can be housed in less space, particularly if they're single. And I think that we need to be able to put more than one structure on a single piece of land that way. I think that would be, a good way to accommodate this. And I do think that most communities have it sort of on the books now. We're seeing more and more basement or secondary suites, granny suites being allowed on properties. We're seeing, for instance, in Midland, some of the big older homes that have those huge lots. One of them was approved to add 10 units on, keep the front facade of the building, put 3 units in that building and add 10 units onto the back of that building. So that's an increase in density. And I think that municipalities are seeing that. But again, the red tape takes so long that the person that actually owned that house, that eventually got the approval for that, lost the house to the bank by the time they got approval from the town to do what they wanted to do. And therefore, what happened is somebody picked it up for a song and did put 3 units in the main part, but the rest has never been built.
Okay.
So,
well, is part of the issue, and the report does talk about this. I don't want to focus on them exclusively, but our attitudes, our biases about how we live as a society in terms of density. This binary kind of, growing up, it was development per se is the devil, and the way it was framed back in the day. which is absurd and simplistic. But the report talked about, NIMBYism, that sort of thing. The reality is we can't continue to sustain a system, it seems to anybody, where 70% of housing in Ontario is either semi-detached or zoned for single accommodation. Something has to give. Would you not agree?
Totally agree.
Yes.
Totally agree. The definition of a home, Grace, you touched on tiny homes, right? And that's something that we spend a lot of time on as well. As
Can I just say, we're not talking for our audience in Tiny Township about homes in tiny. We're talking about very small homes.
Although there are, I just went through a minor variance for a tiny home in tiny. So it's the
Perfect.
tiny home.
Thank you, Steve.
But to that point, so there is an issue where, Doug, to your point, we have to stop defining what a house is for somebody else. And so, NIMBYism, I get it. People don't want stuff built, in Mayberry. But the reality of the situation is it's the fortunate that are complaining, right? And so there are people that own their homes. They've owned their homes for a lot of time. They got a whack load of equity in their homes, and they don't want something unsightly in their backyard. Or if they build something that's, affordable, what type of element will that bring into the community? And there's all kinds of stigmas and all kinds of things that, that we have to find a way to push past, or quite honestly, just get rid of the NIMBYism thing and stop asking. And I know that sounds, terrible, but when you invite public opinion into something, you're going to get public opinion. And then which spills over to votes, which, and again, the politicization of housing is one of the biggest systemic problems that we have in housing. But the other part of it is defining, well, how big should a home be? Grace, again, you pointed out the size of a home. And so, we've been in situations where there's lots, like, we're looking at a 4-acre lot right now in Oro, and the buildable footprint is like 540 square feet. But the requirement of the municipality is that your minimum square footage on your main floor has to be 800 square feet. And so why does my minimum square footage have to be anything? Like, if I'm buying the lot and I own the deed to the thing, why are we regulating what somebody is going to put on there? If they deem a home something that's a tiny home at 700 square feet, then let that be a home, or let multiple structures be on there. We talked about the cost of lots, and if you buy a lot for $500,000 and the city says, or the municipality says, you can only put one home on it, well, I'm starting at $250,000. And everything else out there, building costs. Even if you call it $300 a square foot, 1,000 square foot home is $300,000 on top of $250,000 plus your development fees plus. Like, you're $600,000, $700,000 by the time you're said and done everything. You're putting in a well and septic and some of the other things in the rural communities, and you're on your way to $750,000 for a 1,000 square foot home. So how can that make any sense?
What are the big things that you would do? I said facetiously, it gives you absolute power. A couple of things that would really help move forward. I'll ask our other guests to comment on that, or anything else they want to comment about.
So certainly reduce the bureaucracy behind getting a permit, really give strong consideration to things like, how many units can you put on a property, and really give consideration to the regulations and the restraints that you put on property. So that's something that I think is an absolute must. The other part of it is there is a push for tiny homes. There's a push for shipping container homes. And so a lot of municipalities still have in their bylaws that you can't build a shipping container home. But if you go through the minor variance process, they'll allow you to build a shipping container home. And so I think the municipalities or the townships, or the communities have to do their own homework and say, let's get out of our own way here and start to green light or at least build a runway so that we don't have to go through those processes and bog down the system. So I think that has to happen on a larger scale. And that'll help. Basement apartments, small units and things like that will create some space in the marketplace, because right now there's that log jam at the bottom. And so, but the problem is if the next rung is too high, you get people that are locked in the marketplace like we are. Multi-residential housing, I think one of the considerations that has to take place is, does everybody have to own a home? Europe's already been through this. So I would encourage any, political official who's really deep into, looking at this to go and take a look at what Europe's done, because they've done a far more effective job at affordability than we have in producing affordable housing. They've already figured out a whole lot of things that we could implement here. And so there's solutions that are elsewhere. But the biggest single factor, I think that from a government standpoint, is the cost of land. And so if I have to buy land at full retail, if I'm not a developer that had legacy land or family land for years and years and years, and I've got to buy land at full pop, the premium parts of the land inside of communities are already bought. they're already owned, and they're not going to give them up for a song. And I can't afford to buy those and build, homes on there for affordability. So if I'm pushed to the rural areas, then I run into issues when it comes to government grants or subsidies or different types of financing because I'm not close enough to the service areas. But that's the only land that's available. Okay. And so the government has to get involved on the land side of it, and they have to be willing to grant that land if it's to a not-for-profit, or even to other qualified developers or builders, and not be concerned that the private sector is going to make a dollar with affordable housing. That's another problem that they run into, is they don't want to give that up if somebody's going to make a dollar off of it. But somebody can't make a buck off of it, the solution's not going to be fixed. That's the truth of the matter. And so I think the government land subsidy part is a huge component of it. And I think things like density, on land, and we're dealing with that really right now, where there was an old home, we put 3 units on the back, and we could have put more on there, but the requirement was there had to be X percentage of green space. Well, are we worried about parks, or are we worried about housing? And so I think you have to make some decisions to create, more volume in the marketplace for housing by first scrutinizing heavily the bureaucracy and the red tape that's sort of laid out before us and things like that report, to clear those things to help loosen up the marketplace so people can actually do something.
Got it. Can I put that to you, Grace, as well? You can comment on what Steve has just said, or are there things independent of that you think are part of the solution?
I do believe that density within, in some of the older areas of every town and city should be allowed to be densified, if I can, that's a word, because, and we shouldn't bow to that not in my backyard philosophy that is going on, that I see every time there's a proposal for something that is a little bit different, or that brings a little bit higher density into an area that has enjoyed the luxury of just having larger lots, larger single family homes. What we hear, they come to council and they have all these reasons, but really there's no validity to the reasons. What they're saying is, I don't want those people in my backyard.
Exactly.
And that is what has to change, is the way we look at our fellow human beings and say, there but for whatever am I? Because whatever one human being is capable of, the good, the bad, and the ugly, whatever reason is, some of them are self-inflicted, some of them are not, but that could be me or you or anyone. And we've got to look at it that way.
Very well said, Grace. Thank you for that. Scott, I've been handing around absolute power. If you're interested in exercising it, where would you start to fix the problem?
Yeah, one of the first things that I would do was really just be thinking about our goals and priorities. And I think both Grace and Steve have been mentioning that. One solution that I would really like to see is a big push on producing quite significant amounts of mixed income nonprofit rental housing. Really, that's where our greatest need is for rental housing and for lower cost rental housing. That's not what we're producing right now. And I think the ability of the market to produce that is quite limited. So a non-profit mixed income housing development can be quite economically viable. You can produce units that are affordable to middle income folks, that can help cross-subsidize the lower income folks. And if we reduce barriers to this kind of development, we can get quite a lot of it. Steve was talking about the land costs. And I might say too that the value of these lands and them being so high is really publicly created value in a lot of ways. If a landowner developer is sitting on a piece of land that's gone up by 200%, that's vacant, they haven't contributed to that land growing by that much. It's the publicly created value around it, often transit, schools, reasons that people want to live in that neighborhood. And I think we need to think about whether that quite significant windfall should fall just to the landowners, or whether we should try to capture some of that in some way to produce a public good, in particular through creating affordable housing.
Scott, you know that we got a letter, or I should say a question from, I don't know which one, but one of our local MPs when we solicited community questions. And he wants to know, he's federal, of course. He said, outside of the national housing strategy, what would you like to see the federal government do more to show leadership and bring solutions to solve this affordability issue? So that's a question. And also, are the three levels of government sort of tripping over each other, or could they ever coordinate their policies? I know Steve wants to jump in, but Scott's first.
I'll let Steve handle that second one about the government tripping over each other. But I think something that the federal government could do today that would really make a big impact quite quickly would be focusing on acquisitions of mid-century rental buildings. This is where the bread and butter of the rental market is. Rental buildings built in the 70s, 80s, mostly 70s and 80s. And we've seen rents go up in these buildings. They're privately owned mostly, and we've seen rents go up in these quite quickly. A lot of these are getting sold, often to financialized real estate investment trusts. If the federal government created a system, financing and grants, whereby these could be acquired by nonprofits to run as mixed income nonprofit housing, that's one way that huge numbers of more affordable apartments could be added quite quickly.
Thanks, Scott. Steve, 30 seconds. What do you think? What could these three levels do?
So I don't feel like there's a whole lot of coordination, right? I think everybody sits around and waits for the federal government to announce a pot of capital, and then everybody clamors over how to get that. And then there's stewards of those capitals that then put on a list of 35,000 restrictions on how you actually get the money. So I feel that that's a challenge, right? Because municipalities or the province on its own really doesn't have any money to give towards affordable housing. So to Scott's point, the social housing aspect in the land side of it is the government has to get back in the social housing game, not for social housing creating projects or old school style social housing, but they do need to create a mixed market model, which it's wildly successful in a whole bunch of other places. But the reality is they're going to have to procure the land and procure those areas, or even buy it back from developers before private equities do, and figure out their own way to amortize those costs, to lower them, to make it, to revitalize properties or to create new properties, and figure out within the government of how those are going to get blended down. And then the other thing I would mention very quickly is the government getting involved in ministerial loan guarantees to give the banks comfort for not-for-profits or other groups that are out there to be able to secure private financing to do these projects, so they're not worried about the credit worthiness or just the individual or the developer or the company or the not-for-profit trying to build the units. Get in the game with them, support them. I mean, worst case scenario, somebody defaults, they still own the property and they can figure it out from there. And I think that support from the government would go a long way to breaking up the logjam.
Well, unfortunately, and I warned my guests about this when I talked to you in the lead up to this, we're out of time, and I'm going to have to wrap this up. We could be going on for hours. I learned so much from all of you, but I really appreciate your points of view because I think it's so important. So my sincere thanks to our three guests today, Steve Marshall, Grace Kidd, and Scott Leon. They've got different points of view, but as our audience has seen, they're passionate about finding solutions to this problem. So we really benefited for their insights from their experience. I thank you all. And for now, thanks for watching and joining us, and stay safe.